well, I don't want to be too biological, but I think the earlier the brain, especially the verbal center of the brain, the linguistic center, is, if I may say, stimulated by verbal stimuli, the more we'll absorb and the more flexible we become in appropriating new structures of language, more structures of language, diverse structures of language, therefore giving to the child itself later on much more initiative with language, much more creative approach to language, and much more, if I may say, in this case, if I may use a technical term, open-endedness in the way that he sees language, or she sees language, as a continuous process. He won't take language as being a sort of a behaviorist model that I have to simply copy and follow. The mind of a child is not, if I may say, possessed by grammatical rules and regulations. There are some innate rules in the way that we learn language, as Chomsky has proved, and so many other linguists, but at the same time there's a lot of flexibility, which has to do with the way that each one of us, especially from an early age, individuates language. Because despite the fact that we have a sort of a language is a collective sort of a creation, it belongs to everybody, it is learned by somebody outside us, each one of us individuates language, that is to say, personalizes language, takes things that are closer to his or her needs, and then it appropriates them and uses them appropriately. So that's a very important aspect of language. The language is a very flexible mechanism. It's not a mechanism that is rigid. It's not a mechanism that it is a sort of a, if I may say, normalizes your mind, but on the contrary, gives you some foundational beginnings, and then it lets you loose to do whatever you want with language itself. And literature, being the most emotive, emotional usage of language, and the most, in this case, creative usage of language, especially expands the limits of the linguistic ability for the child early. We have to go back to the famous dictum by Ludwig Wittgenstein, "The limits of my language are the limits of my world." So if you have early in your life very broad, wide, and, if I may say, endless limits to your language, that will be the limits of your world. Because at the moment you appropriate language, you appropriate an image of the world that this language, or Wittgenstein called it a form of life, that this language represents, stands for, it indicates. So by giving all these things to the child, I think the earlier the better. Psychology of children tells us that essentially even the 18th month of its life, a child is able not simply to listen and distinguish between words, even abstract and unknown words, actually words from another language even, but it can reproduce them. And not simply reproduce them, but they can become part of its identity, because, as we know, our identity, personal identity, is made, is constructed, is constituted through what linguists again call the loom of language. You don't have an identity without the language. And the more, if I may say, linguistic performance you have early in your life, the richer your personality will be, the more open you will be to other people. You discover difference, you'll discover otherness, if I may say, and you'll be more, if I may say, receptive, which is the most important thing, in innovation, in creativity, and finally, if I may say something very important, in this case, I don't know if all of them become writers or something like that, into take a sort of a kind of an innovative approach with language itself, intervening within the process of language, therefore creating new linguistic structures of your own, which is very important in this case. You can see that it happens with children between the 4th and the 6th year of their life, when they use, that you listen to children talking, but there's nobody listening to them, because language itself becomes a pleasure. And not simply becomes a pleasure, it becomes a creative ability of appropriating the world around them. By naming things, they're able to control their environment. So they don't feel, in most occasions, as you see, traumatized, and they don't feel if I may say, in existentialist terms, terrorized by the world. They think that by naming something, that something becomes part of my world, which is very important. And I think it is the more linguistic exposure, if I may say, and the performability that these kids have in front of them through most media, if I may say, a theatrical performance, by listening to literature, by seeing literature or Shakespeare or theatre being enacted bodily, with the body. All of these make these children, the mind of the children, first of all, accelerates its maturity, the way to maturity, the process of maturation, as they call it, and makes them more active with language. Because for us as teachers, it's very interesting to see children at the university being unable to use language. First of all, they don't have critical skills. In order to go with analysis, to analyze something, first of all, you must have, if I may call it, a descriptive vocabulary. Your vocabulary must be rich and diverse enough in order to describe nuances, the different grades and shades of colors, the different, shapes of books and the different formats that these things exist. If you don't have this vocabulary, this is a book, but doesn't mean anything. It's essentially an abstract notion. To give you an example, the Inuits, the Eskimos of Canada, have 46 words to describe the nuances of the snow, because this is part of the world. So it's not white for us, who see snow very infrequently. Snow is white. For the people who see snow every day, snow is not white. It is blue, it is red, it's all of the above, plus some words that don't exist in English to describe the different shades of the colors itself. The same happens with the experience itself, the way that I experience a sort of a kind of a book, or even a movie, a film, or whatever, even an ice cream for a child, is a matter of individuating experience, of how they can express that experience that they have. An ice cream is sweet, but it's not sweet for all of them, for all children. So if your language is impoverished, if it becomes simply, if I may use another technical term, instrumental and not expressive, you're not going to impart your feelings, you're not going to impart your reactions to that. Nobody will understand who you are. And that's, as a teacher, especially at the university, I can see the problem quite visible in front of my eyes, that students cannot describe their own feelings, their own reactions, and they simply copy what they see in front of them. And when you ask them, what do you think about this, then there is silence, because they don't have the analytic vocabulary, which is a product of continuous exposure to different linguistic expressions, to different verbalizations, if I may say. Linguistic performance, the way that we express, we utter words, the way that we use language, as you see, involves the whole of our existence, of our presence, the body. You can't say, gestures are not simply gestures, they enunciate what language actually says. If you simply insist on one aspect of linguistic performance, it's like fragmenting the linguistic phenomenon, giving the kids, children the idea that this is it, only this and nothing else. So by giving them a fragmented perception of linguistic performance, you don't help them to develop their own linguistic skills, which are innate and they're cerebral, they're in the brain, they belong to the universal grammar of the brain. And I think it's wrong to insist on one aspect. You have to show language as a total phenomenon. And it's a total phenomenon because it involves not simply the mental skills, that is to say, the conceptualizing abilities of the children, not simply the way that something will be pronounced by using the mouth and this expression, but the body, interaction, the way that I respond to your questions, because I don't simply talk, I simply talk with you. All language is dialogic. There's no such a thing as a monologue. Even when Hamlet soliloquizes, is on stage, and hundreds of people are watching him talking to himself, but he's not talking to himself, he's talking to us. So all language is a dialogic form of communication. You communicate feelings. So insisting on only the phonics of language, even one aspect of language, is essentially as fragmenting it, breaking into something which is so unnatural and will never impact your feelings or your thoughts or your reactions, in this case, to the person you're talking with. I had the idea that if I give them Shakespeare or the great literature of the past, will essentially control the mind of the people, because Shakespeare is not simply Shakespeare. Very few people read Shakespeare simply for the pleasure of reading Shakespeare. I think what you have to do is the holistic approach to language restitutes that, saves the original pleasure that we have when we are exposed to beautiful language, well-articulated language, to even the melody of the vowels and the consonants. This is very important, I think, because what after 20 or 30 years of postmodernism has happened is that children, especially at tertiary education level, are unable to evaluate. Not simply to think critically, not simply to, if I may say, pronounce words appropriately, but they are unable to evaluate between meanings. And for them, there's no difference between a meaning which is, if I may say, of restricted value, with something which is of wider and much more collective importance. I will call it more holistic and humanistic approach now to language. Now, I mean, we are more eclectic methodologically. We choose from here and there, but the whole approach is more holistic in the sense that you have to energize the whole of the mind and the existence of the kid, of the child, of the growing mind, in order to make it experience language as a total phenomenon, not something fragmented. For the second year of your life, you learn how to pronounce words. The third year of your life, you learn how to do grammar. The fourth year of your life, you're going to pronounce correctly. And the sixth and seventh year of life, you write correct sentences. This is, as you understand, so mechanical that it becomes in itself really utopian and really wrong, because the kids, after you give them the opportunity to be exposed to expressive and extremely, if I may say, holistic approach to language, they will accelerate their own learning processes themselves, and they will ask for more, and you will simply be delaying them, and will simply become the impediment to the learning process instead of facilitating that. Facilitating kids to learn more and learn more effectively. They feel they can place themselves more effectively, their own existence within this expanding world, because we have to see the world of 1-year-old kid, 2-year-old kid, 3 and 4 and 6 until they go to school, is constantly expanding. It's constantly becoming larger and larger, has more needs, has more communicative needs to have to express more and more things. And this is what it's going to do. This very transgeneric, if I may call it, just exposure to different genres, that is to say, will give them the possibility to respond to their growing needs and the growing demands that the environment itself places on them. Because it's not simply the needs of the child, it's the needs of the society. They become socialized gradually. The needs that the demands that the society asks from them, they go to, if I may say, to a religious meeting, they go to everything, the socializing process, from the family to school to church to wherever they go. This places demands on them. How do they respond to this?
One of the points that the professors from the Macquarie University with whom we dealt with made was how the importance of young children socializing around literature. In fact, the language skills and development that arise out of children socializing with themselves around literature, peers, so 3- and 4-year-olds having conversations between each other about stories and about books, or it might be nursery rhymes in that case, that in fact there is accelerated learning that occurs in that social interaction that couldn't occur between teacher and child.
well, that's the other aspect of learning, and if I may say, the learning process itself, because they don't learn from the teacher. The teacher must be the facilitator.
Yeah.
You must facilitate how knowledge is given to these children and how the children interact with each other in the space that belongs to them to learn the learning process, or with the teacher himself or herself. I think it's very important in this case because nursery rhymes, stories, fairy tales, all of this become symbols of identification and places where all recognize each other and can communicate. If you see, you never forget this because they, if I may use the term again, they're hardwired in you. They're not simply added later on. They become part of your growing up process of growing up and the process of becoming yourself. So they become part of your skills to socialize with other people. It's interesting to see that people, students, especially in tertiary education, that I see them now being formed and completed as individuals who are silent, had always problem of being socializing with other children because they didn't have common myths, they didn't have common, therefore, stories to talk about. They couldn't exchange common symbols that could have been common to both of them. They don't know except popular culture when they grow up and they watch TV and these kind of things. But before that, something that interacted with them, you know, in the classroom, they don't have it. So they become silent, withdrawn. And in most occasions, as you understand, is the first, if I may say, these are the first signs of melancholia and even depression. So, if I may so say, impoverished linguistic communication leads to all these problems. Many psychologists believe that even, if I may say, schizophrenia is a part of a linguistic error. And all these major problems that we have, unless there's something, an obvious structural problem in the brain, many psychological, if I may say, ailments have always referred to language, the way that children learned, appropriated, and used language in the formative years of their life between the 2nd and the 6th, which are very important in this case. Because language means also psychological release. If you don't have release that language offers you, and you're bottled up with these negative emotions, as you think, this is the beginning of a sort of a deterioration in your personality process. The way that your personality comes together. You don't have an integrated personality. Language creates integrated personalities. That is to say, a personality with cohesion, with a sense of a linguistic center. It's not simply the center that we have. It's not simply our body. It's not simply our mind. It's predominantly fleshed out linguistically. If you don't have these abilities to do that, then you create yourself gaps, something like vacuums in your personality, which later on might evolve into, if I may say, psychological problems. And I think that as a teacher, I have had that experience with students in many, many occasions. I have seen it happening in front of my eyes. So I believe in literature, in this case, because it gives you this so much, if I may say, emotional release, such emotional enrichment, plays that role of the catalyst and makes the children already from the 3rd and the 4th and the 5th year of their life, let alone when they go to school, which is something else then, the processes are already there, develop self-awareness, a sense of the space that belongs to them, very important in this case, and finally, if I may say, a sense of self-esteem. They're not afraid, they're not intimidated, and they are not, in most occasions, if I may say, devaluing themselves, that they don't know something, because they can respond. They're in the learning process, and linguistic performance, linguistic ability, makes them respond to what happens around them. The most successful lives, in the plural, are the responsive lives. That you have so many, sort of, if I may say, challenges that you have to respond, but you must have a way of responding, and that will be your way, not something imposed from you from outside. as you was happening in the past through, the authoritarian education or churches or the state. You must become, and that will be sort of you must enable yourself. You must become, if I may use the other term, empower yourself between the 2nd and the 6th year of your life. Very critical, formative years, extremely crucial for the development of the psychology, self-awareness, and self-esteem. Helps, assists, but in the early age, I think it has to play this supportive role. The most important role will be human interaction. Human interaction, because that will energize the senses of the child. He must or she must be start feeling, experiencing its own abilities to feel and experience. So technology will help, will assist, will become very important, especially later in the life. But you are exposed to images, colors, and these kind of things. They have their own value in itself. I mean, we learn so much from TV, watching TV. You learn always, and you see people moving, people talking, people experience. You listen to words and structures that you never listen sometimes, and then you hear something that even in good literature you don't find it very often. A very, if I may say, vibrant sense of the vernacular, of the spoken language, which is very important as well. That the literature is good, but don't forget that the literature is an emotional language. It's a language made of selections, stylistic selections. The vernacular has another impact on the formation of the kids, of the children, and it's part of the socializing process. I think that all of this must work in a synergistic way, and the teacher or the carer, as a coordinator of this, must know how to gradually measure, in a measured way, give them to the child, so that the world expands in a world in a way that is not going to implode. Because if you give the child a lot of things, sometimes they will be unable to absorb them all. You have to see the potentialities of the child itself. What can take, what the child itself can take from this, and gradually measure that's why you have other children.
Absolutely.
Because you have a measure of comparison. You have to compare. The most important thing is that the children themselves will compare with each other. Look how the other responds, and there will be a very healthy, in that case, sense of I'll do what the other is doing. So this is because, as you remember, a philosopher says that what is distinct in the human species, especially in that period, is what he calls the mimetic desire. The desire to imitate what the other is doing. The mimetic desire is the beginning of everything we're doing. Because you see your parents, you see your father, you see your mother, and you do the same things. You follow them. You say that because you are still in that age, part of their own existence. You have not been an independent, autonomous being. That will happen later on. You are still linked to them. So the mimetic desire is very important, because through it you discover who you are by establishing networks of communication with people around you and of your immediate environment or the school environment itself and the teacher itself. But the teacher must act as the facilitator and the coordinator, not as the, if I may say, the regulator of this.
No. Well, that's very much in keeping with our philosophy.
Very good, very good. That's a very humanistic and holistic approach, which actually sees learning as a two-way process.
Yes.
Not simply giving, actually simply having the child as a passive state of receiving these kind of things, but make the child active participant in the process of learning. They start talking to themselves, and you will see when you have them in the class. So they will start talking themselves. What do they mean by that? Who is the listener of this?
The witness.
So very important in this case, and that means when a child starts talking to itself, that means that self-consciousness starts emerging. And because of the mimetic desire, has to see it happening in another child as well. Because if you're isolated from another child, that's it. So these monologues are in reality implicit dialogues with each other and with itself. So that means self-consciousness, self-awareness, introspective conscience, introspection, and then the question, who am I? Which is very important and will empower the child when he goes to school. I mean, since we have to go to school, they have to go to school. It's compulsory when they turn 6 or 7. You have to send them there with a sense of identity, that I do have an identity. I'm not here to be reinvented from zero, from scratch. I do have an identity, which is true. What this process will do is will make themselves, the process that already in place, more conscious and more obvious and more visible to the children themselves and their family, their kids, their parents, and the immediate environment. Otherwise, I think children will go to school. Schools are good, as we know.
Schools are not.
Are good,
yes.
Or institutional schools,
yes.
But schools, as you understand, are very function according to certain rules. For them, children are not individuals anymore, are a classroom, a class of. So I think that the formative years between the 2nd and 6th are the years that are going to create identities, solid identities, cohesive personalities, and finally, I think, if I may say in this case, personalities with a self-awareness and a sense of self-esteem. Very important.
And a strong, rich and expansive linguistic foundation.
But these are the expression of that, because if you can't express who you are, when you go to school, as you understand, you'll be withdrawn, you'll be bullied, you'll experience all the negative, if I may say, effects or side effects of institutionalized knowledge, institutionalized learning. Mass education is good, but as it has become so massive these days, that people, now it doesn't cater for the needs of individuals. And that's another thing to be discussed, how educational problems at school are made, and of course who compiles them. And because most of these programs, the curricula itself, as you know from the NAPLAN test in Australia, is a system that simply valorizes its own systemic values. It's not open to the creativity of the children. It simply says you have to follow these rules, and if you follow these rules, you're good. Which essentially is the opposite of what we are trying to do.
Absolutely.
The NAPLAN test is sort of going back to the 70s, the behaviorist model of learning language with for no reason, first of all, and then without recognizing the ability of the child to differ, to be a distinct personality, and to offer a new sense of linguistic performance. If you say that simply you have to repeat these structures, forget it. This is not language anymore. That becomes a grammatical rule. But
okay,
that's it.